some shifts very recently around how one is to treat mastitis. And the shifts are pretty major, things like going from hot to cold, things from recognize that they're not minor shifts at all. But what I wanted Torey to do was come in and just really help lay the groundwork for what is different, what has changed, how it is she's using these changes working with clients now, and really leaving a good chunk of time at the end for questions and for conversation. When Torey gets back,
So I'm back. I'm going to try without video and see if it
okay.
works better. I've got a
Okay.
strong signal, so.
Can I draw a picture of you? I could draw a picture of you. Could you just, I wanted you to just very quickly, as a peer, as a contemporary, could you share just a bit about the bra? Because I'm concerned that a lot of people have not seen, touched, or even thought about what a massage bra might be. So before we get into this, and before we start describing massage and the role of massage in dealing with mastitis, could you just give a quickie on the bra and what in particular it is, just what is different about the bra from the view of somebody who's an IBCLC?
Sure, absolutely. So the bra itself is essentially very similar to a hands-free pumping bra, aside from the fact that it has the, battery device in it, and surrounding each cup essentially are pockets of air that fill and empty to massage the breast while you pump. And so there's the powering device sits between the breasts, and you can tighten or loosen and fit it to comfort. And it has two different settings, two different speed settings as well.
And so that's very applicable to a lot of these change guidelines. So I'm going to jump back over to that. From where I'm sitting, it feels like they came out of like almost nowhere. So I'm wondering if you could just help me a little bit with the backstory on these shifts and protocols. How did we get from where we were until it to this sudden place where hot is cold and cold is hot? And how did we get here?
Right. I think you're right. It took some of us by surprise, I think, because it sort of took everything that we knew previously and sort of turned it upside down. But the AABM does base their guidelines on peer-reviewed clinical research, and so their new mastitis protocol comes from some new research, which suggests that we may have had it wrong when we thought that the cause of mastitis was clogged milk duct, incomplete milk removal. But rather it happens due to an inflammation and narrowing of the duct. And that's caused by oversupply, or what they call an imbalance in the microbiome. So yeah, you're right. It kind of seemed surprising, but also, based in studies. So we like to be on top of new research, and that's kind of where we get these guidelines from. So that's how it all started.
So that said, what would you say stand out as the biggest changes, first on paper, but then in specific, in working specifically with clients?
Right, so there's quite a few changes for those of you that are familiar with the new guidelines. One big change is, like you said, they're suggesting cold instead of heat, with the idea that cold decreases inflammation, while heat can increase inflammation. So that's one big change. Another one is to avoid deep breast massage. We used to tell people, find that firm spot, vigorously massage it to try to clear that clog, if you will. And so now the new recommendation is gentle massage, as opposed to that deeper, more vigorous massage. So those are two big changes among many.
So when we talk about, digging into that spot versus the lighter massage, I think, it was painful to start with, and then digging into that spot, the instructions were to kind of just go after it, if you would. So that's a real shift and a real difference in philosophy in terms of so very many things. It requires a woman to almost self-regulate. And I think that's where the Lilu bra becomes a very important tool. And that is, can you walk through that a little bit?
Sure. Well, like you said, it can be hard to sort of regulate the pressure that you use with your own hands. and kind of distribute it evenly. So with the bra, you can keep it gentle, essentially. Whereas with your hands, it can be we can tend to overdo it a bit, particularly when there's a firm spot. And then you could be causing more damage that way. So that's why they're moving away from that. You don't want to damage that tissue further.
I think there's something to be said here about the word gentle, both in terms of a physical response, but also in terms of motivation. So the motivation isn't just like, go, go, go. It's really more about, we're going to start listening to our bodies a bit more, which I'm obviously a big advocate of. So while I understand this is about mastitis as an infection, I remain a little bit optimistic that we can help women to be less demanding of themselves. Do you think I'm possibly onto something?
Sure, I definitely think you're onto something, because it's can kind of be a form of self-care. Your breasts are taking on a new role, and we do need to be gentle with ourselves, and particularly when you've got this condition where you might have some inflammation. I think being gentle is key. So I think it's a good change away from that really vigorous kind of not so gentle and sort of damaging yourself.
Yeah. So we're talking right now about reactive, and I just want to spend just one more question or two about reacting to having mastitis, and then I want to move on to sort of a bigger picture. I was on LinkedIn this morning on a really interesting thread, and a woman was talking about how she went back to work too early, ended up with mastitis on a business trip, which is everybody's kind of, it's a nightmare. What would a lactation consultant in IBCLC, what would they tell a woman who is not at home, who's traveling and finds herself in this position?
Well, hopefully we talk first about prevention, and kind of preventing this from happening in the first place. I mean, obviously this person that you're talking about, it's too late for that, right? But if we take a step back and we talk about prevention a little bit, under the new guidelines, they focus a lot on oversupply, and managing oversupply can definitely reduce your chances of getting mastitis. If you have one of those risk factors, oversupply, you can start to work on downregulating your milk supply, in the hopes of preventing this from happening in the first place. So you can do this by decreasing the amount that you pump. Some people do block feeding, so feeding on one breast at a time, in the hopes that you kind of downregulate that supply and take away that risk factor in the first place.
Is that something that you would recommend people who have clients getting ready to just simply go back to work, not even traveling? Is that part of how you would now prepare them to go back to work?
When people are going back to work, I think they worry a lot about having enough milk.
The freezer full. You always talk about the freezer full. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure out there to have a freezer full, but that's not necessary. And you just need to make enough milk for your baby. And I always remind my clients of that. So, you're really more in a state of maintaining your milk supply when you go back to work. And it's just a matter of trying your best to carve out the time to empty the breasts at the right intervals and not wait too long. And I know that's not easy, and depending on what type of job you have, it can be very difficult, but it's really just about milk removal, consistent milk removal, to maintain that milk supply. And I tell people, you're pumping on Monday what you'll use on Tuesday. You don't need a freezer full of milk to go back to work.
And that is definitely a myth that has carried forward for generations. I wrote a piece, it could even be 10 years ago, talking about different ways that postpartum depression shows itself in the workplace. And one of them is overachieving. And this falls into the overachieving, right? So it's coming back to work like, oh, nothing ever happened. But it's the same thing with the milk. I've got a freezer full of milk and I can do anything. Well, that is, results may vary, as they say. So I think that's very, very good advice. So is there anything else, any more specific ways you would suggest people speak to these new guidelines within their practices, perhaps how they would suggest they speak to women. We've established, obviously, that not every woman's going to need this information, but are there ways to incorporate this preventatively and reactively into a person's practice?
Sure. I mean, I think it's important for all of us as IBCLCs to at least just read and familiarize yourself with the new protocols. And there's a variety of sources. Obviously, the ABM protocol itself, it's a little bit lengthy, but it's not too bad. And then there are a few, articles and blog posts and things that kind of summarize it very well. So familiarize yourself with the new guidelines. And, when it comes to my clients, and again, this is just for people that have this issue, it's not like everyone, but I would explain the reasoning behind these changes. And also, we talked about this before, Julia, these clients, perhaps it's their first baby and they don't even know what the old protocols were. So it's kind of irrelevant to them. Unless you had mastitis before with a previous child, you probably don't know that these are new protocols. So you're talking about the reasoning behind doing what you do. So I think it's important for people to understand that. You're going to use cold because you have inflammation in the breast. You're not going to vigorously massage, etc. But unless they know the old protocols, it probably doesn't make much difference to them that this is a huge change for all of us.
It's true, except for we are, at least I am, so adamant about seeking out peer support. The mother that came before. I am a huge advocate of paying it forward. So make sure you get to the next mother and give them the support that you either received or wanted to receive. So you do know that these things get whispered down the lane. So, you're right about it being a first baby. But on the other hand, here I am telling everybody, go find somebody who did this 6 months ago. Oops.
You could be getting outdated advice from a peer, right?
Yeah. So I might need to stop saying that for a while. All right. I promised to leave a really hearty amount of time for this. Let me just go through a few quick things. I want to take questions and I want everybody to feel free to ask them. And I'm actually going to ask some questions as well, because I see where you all are from and I have some specific geographic questions. I'm ready to start taking questions, but I see a woman here named Tammy from Toronto. And I'm curious, Tammy, you have a very different world in terms of your maternity leave. It's much different than here in the States. And the short leave is not an issue for you. So Tammy, tell us, do you have a lower instance of mastitis where there's longer leave for new mothers?
I really wish you folks had a longer mat leave. I think the maternity leave has gone to a year and now 18 months for a lot of women if they choose to. Certainly they can also share with the paternity leave as well. Anyway, what I will say is I work only in the NICU. So although we do see mastitis here, and I'm really going to have to get outside my paradigm or whatever to go into the new the new guideline, because I've been practicing since 1997 as a lactation consultant. So right, what's the changes are huge. But I will say that definitely mothers breastfeed longer. The incidence of mastitis, I don't really know because my practice is only in the NICU. So although we do see it here, that population is more compromised with anxiety and stress and only pumping for the most part. So there's a lot going on there. And we generally transfer to a level 2 when they start to do well and start to do the feeding. So my population is pretty narrow. I didn't see anybody else from Canada here. So
that's why I called you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I wish I could be more helpful.
No, we're actually very, very interested in the NICU population, and that's going to be one of the options for the next one. So you should vote for it. Just a little,
sure,
because that's very interesting and very important to us. So, and the anxiety you're talking about is top of mind at Lilu. We've been talking about it a lot. How do we help a mother have a little bit more control in that scenario? But that's going to have to wait to the next session.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tammy.
Tammy, it's certainly not surprising at all that the breastfeeding rates are higher later on. You have that longer time off work to establish breastfeeding and, be able to stick with it longer, perhaps. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
So I see a question here from, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Jalen, I hope that's right. She's asking, do you have any suggestions, Torey, for treatment of recurrent mastitis several months after cessation of breastfeeding? It's a really interesting question.
That is an interesting question. Several months after cessation of breastfeeding. Wow. I mean, I assume we're talking about like full-blown bacterial mastitis. Probably at that point, you'd need cultures. And I don't know, I assume we're talking about a specific case study here. I would say the person needs to get cultures and find a very targeted antibiotic to treat it, because it seems like whatever treatment is happening is probably not working. That sounds unusual to me.
Yeah, she says thank you, and I agree. It sounds unusual, but it also sounds very frustrating for that woman. I do, Adriana, see a couple of people here from the Philadelphia area. I just want to reiterate that this was actually a product of work at the University of Pennsylvania, and Diane Spatz, who, if you're in Philadelphia, you probably know that name, worked very closely with CJ and Adriana. Excuse me, to bring this to life. So just an aside for you, for the Philly girls out there. Are there other questions?
While we wait for other questions, I have a question. We get a lot of moms that are constantly worried about their milk production, right? And so when mastitis occurs, there's probably a little bit more anxiety and concern around like how if that's going to affect their milk supply. And with the new guidelines, right, that, like you mentioned, Torey, like suggesting things like block feeding or things like that, I think, right, we're probably going to see more commonly moms experience dips in their milk supply with mastitis, or I'm assuming, am I interpreting that correctly? And like, what would you then advise, for when moms do get mastitis, maybe how can they manage their expectations of how will that impact their milk supply, and what will happen, in the next few days as that infection resolves?
Yeah, that's a good question. So milk supply can definitely take a dip with mastitis. And I think that's regardless of which protocols you're looking at. So I'm not sure if these new protocols would have more or less of an impact on milk supply per se. But, the most important thing is resolving the actual acute issue first, and then dealing with the potential decrease in milk supply that may follow. And I do see that quite a bit, usually just in the affected breast. And I will say that the vast majority of people find that their milk supply bounces back after the acute mastitis has resolved. So I don't know if these new protocols would have an impact one way or the other on overall milk supply. I think the key is just treating the infection, treating the inflammation, and then you can work on, maybe some additional steps to try to, get your milk supply back. Like with any illness, really, getting sick.
No, and that brings up another interesting point. Again, pointing our fingers at ourselves here in the US. It is not something to rush back into your everyday life with an infection that requires antibiotics. Also requires rest, and it's hard to get enough rest anyway as a new mother. But Torey, can you speak a little bit to the power of actually taking the time to try to acknowledge and get yourself enough rest and liquids and everything you need to get over the infection, versus kind of not ignoring it, but just moving ahead without treating it well as an individual?
Yeah, powering through is probably the worst thing that you can do if you have an infection. And we all know this, whether it's, viral cold or COVID or any kind of illness, your body needs that rest to recover and heal. So it's and also mastitis can just make you feel really awful as well. So you probably won't be up for much anyway. But you can start to feel better, you know, pretty quickly, but you still need to allow yourself the time to recover. And that means resting, getting enough fluids. You're right. Yeah.
I was wondering, from the perspective of the lactation consultant, how have you successfully convinced a woman to slow down?
I just remind people to not be afraid to ask for help, you know, bring in help, because it's very difficult to care for yourself when you're sick and to take care of your baby. So having another set of hands around is hugely important. Having someone take care of you so that you can continue to take care of your baby. And that may mean keeping your water bottle refilled, cooking you meals, making sure you take your medicine, and you know, take over baby duties as much as possible so that you can be allowed to rest.
But in the meantime, question for you, Torey, do you recommend using warm compresses ever?
Sure. Yeah. This particular protocol change is strictly, you know, around mastitis and inflammation. And so, yes, warmth and heat are still recommended, let's say for like initial engorgement that you may have. So, you know, sometimes it's that day 4, day 5, when the milk is coming in. So heat is still recommended for that. Or for just helping with letdown, usually more in the first couple weeks, I would say. So it's not like heat is totally out. It's just out for this particular condition.
Is there a cool compress on the market that you are particularly fond of, that you think does a better job than others, or is it fairly generic?
That's a good question. There is one, I wish I could think of the name. Maybe someone knows it. It's the one with the little purple beads, and I believe it can be used for heat.
The purple beads is, I think that is Lancino. I have a question here from Gina Smith, who asks, what advice to give to moms that don't have support? And, you know, this is not atypical. We don't live in villages anymore. It's more common than not to live far from our families of origin. So Gina's asking, she imagines that there are several moms that can't take off work or don't have people nearby. So what advice do you give?
Right, that's such a difficult situation. I would say try and find support groups. And I know for myself, I lead a new mom support group, a 0 to 4 month support group that is virtual. So there were lots of virtual support groups all over the place. There are in-person support groups as well. So that at the very least you could provide that peer support and just being able to talk to other people who are in your situation, I think is hugely valuable, because you can feel lonely. Even if you're not alone, it can feel lonely and like no one knows what I'm going through, when in reality there are a lot of people that know what you're going through, and just talking things through with them and getting peer support, I think is hugely valuable.
I know there's a company called Let Mama Sleep that offers free overnight nursing for military spouses. So that's a big plus. I saw a few people here from North Carolina. North Carolina has the highest percentage of military bases in the country, something I learned doing some work down at UNC.
We can also share, for instance, resources like the Chocolate Milk Cafe, specifically for moms of color, right? So they have different chapters. But that's a great question, and we'd be super happy to collect here some of those virtual resources, so including Torey's, and we can send that as a follow-up to the group, again, some of the virtual support groups, so that you can share them with your clients.
That's great. Here's another one for you, Torey. Have you had success with lectin supplements?
Oh, lecithin. Yes.
Lectin, sorry.
Yeah, that is still recommended. And I do recommend that to people, particularly if they are prone to this, you know, kind of clogged ducts and mastitis. It's a preventive. And so yeah, I do recommend that sunflower lecithin. It can be taken, you know, singly, like on its own, or sometimes people will take it, you know, with other herbal supplements as well. But basically the idea is sort of decreases the viscosity of the milk and helps with milk flow.
That's actually very interesting. So we'll add that to our resources and our ideas. All right, we've got time for about 5 more questions. If you all have 5 more questions, and then I'm going to put up the questionnaire. I know people are asking again how to get the bras, and Adriana, you've put that up a couple times. It's very simple. You just click and give a little bit of information as in where we can send it, and we will send it to you. So, are there any other questions? And Torey, now that you've heard all these questions, is there anything you want to add?
I would just say familiarize yourself with these new guidelines. I know among my fellow lactation consultants and peers that I work with, it came as quite a surprise to us. But the more we kind of examined it and learned more about it, you know, there's research behind it, and it does make sense. So it can be hard to have your kind of whole idea of something sort of flipped upside down. But as with everything in healthcare, we make changes based on new things that we learn. So I think it's important to, you know, familiarize yourself and let your clients know what these new protocols are.
Fantastic.
I wanted to ask Torey a question while we bring the next poll up. But again, kind of looking at the very typical like Lilu customer, we get also a lot of moms that are trying kind of, we already covered this, like building your freezer stash. I don't imagine that mentality or goal is gonna go away very soon, right? So how can we kind of explain to moms a bit better, right, that there has to be that balance of like not overdoing it? Again, kind of talking about those preventative measures. So how would you advise a mom? Like, how do they know? Like, are there some kind of clear guidelines of like, again, when you might be at risk that you might be, like setting yourself up for that oversupply? How would you address that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's difficult to send yourself into oversupply when you're already sort of 3 months, 4 months out. So that would be unusual to just be pumping so much that you kind of go overboard. It's usually earlier on that happens, and then we have to sort of back off a little bit. But you're right, this whole mentality, I mean, there's so much social media, you know, and you see these like photos posted of like, these are filled to the brim with milk, and it's just not realistic and it's not necessary. So the more we can kind of spread the word about what is needed for going back to work, which is really just enough milk for that day, for the next day, with maybe a little bit of a buffer. Hopefully we can decrease this anxiety that so many moms have around going back to work. I mean, I have so many clients that just sort of assume that they're going to have to quit breastfeeding when they go back to work. It's almost like an assumption that this is not going to work once I'm going to work. And so it'd be nice if we could kind of dispel that myth and support people a little better. Obviously, in this country, we need to do better with our leave policy. That could be a whole other subject, right? But yeah, I think it'd be unusual to really just send yourself into oversupply if you're just emptying the breasts at regular intervals enough when you're away from your baby. And then I always encourage people to, when you are together and with your baby, you should be focusing on breastfeeding. Hopefully you won't be doing a ton of pumping otherwise.
Victoria shared that, and this is interesting. I mean, it's not economically viable for everybody, but she says try to work part-time if you can. If you have to work, more time with baby, less stress, less childcare expense, very important. More time for yourself, better ability, I guess, to maintain milk supply, less pumping. That's interesting. It's an interesting perspective, definitely. She asked you a question also, actually Tina asked you a question. She asked, have the recommendations for plugged ducts changed? And if so, what do you recommend for just plug ducts as opposed to mastitis, full mastitis?
So yes, they kind of have changed in the sense that this idea of what a plug duct is sort of has changed. So again, we're moving away from that vigorous, deep massage of a plugged duct. We're working on obviously prevention of it in the first place, but a more gentle, method of clearing that clog. Because again, the idea that it's more inflammatory rather than a backup of milk or milk stasis that's happening. So it's kind of like a big picture, mastitis, clogged ducts, all of it is sort of a spectrum. So it does kind of fall under this whole umbrella of the new protocol, a shift away from the more vigorous kind of massage that we were doing and the heat and all that. And the lecithin, like we talked about earlier, is a good, component of that preventive care as well.
Is that an age-related thing? So you're talking about the milk of, and I'm not going to get the language right, but how thick the milk is basically. Is it genetic? Is it change with a woman's age? Like what impacts that?
That's a good question. I don't know of any research regarding the causes of that, or if it's related to age. It kind of goes back, like a risk factor of oversupply is kind of what it comes down to. That's a risk factor right there. I don't know about age or anything else being factors.
It's interesting. Well, because the idea of looking at older moms, we know now that the average age of birth in this country is 30, and average is obviously an average. So, we're talking about older mothers now. I personally was called advanced maternal age in the year 2002. I was 35. And now, obviously I'm still 35, but that's a given. But the idea that, these mothers we're all getting older, and older mothers are becoming the norm. It's something to be curious about. That's all. I want to quickly thank Dawn, who said this was an excellent presentation. Thank you. And you are very welcome. We were so looking forward to doing this presentation, and we were so excited by the response, all of you who showed up. So you are welcome, but really thank you.